Welcome back to the Solid Verbal. Boys and girls, my name is Ty Hildenbrandt, my beloved co-host. If you're watching the video, not on the right side of the screen, he's actually out of the country at the moment, enjoying a little bit of downtime before the machine of the season gets going. He'll be back before long. Coincidentally, though, our guest of honor today is in the heart of the Midwest, Chicago, Illinois. So there's that. He is Matt Brown. You know him from the Extra Points newsletter with Matt Brown. You know him from this podcast. We've had him on a bunch of times to discuss all sorts of pressing issues. One of my favorite guests, not just because he's a great dude and has a great head of hair on him, but I always come away feeling like I learned something from these discussions. Matt, how you doing? Good to have you back.
It's great to be back. It's I can't do a good Dan impression. My pizza skills are not anywhere in that same stratosphere. But I'm always glad to spend a little bit of time with you.
I wanted to bring you back on one more time before the season gets going as sort of a progress report, a checkpoint of sorts to get an update on where we stand in college football on a bunch of notable topics.
Sure.
This is the week that the Fitzgerald stuff went down. We can talk about that a little bit later on, but I don't want to start off on that note because my sense is that everyone's already been overwhelmed by the news over the last 48, 72 hours or so.
Yeah.
It'd be malpractice if I didn't start this without talking about the video game.
Sure.
Because that is what brings people joy. That is inevitably when I ask folks, what do you want me to ask Matt Brown about? They all unanimously say the video game. So there has been some news in the world of EA Sports college football in that proposed boycotts have been floated recently surrounding, I guess, the compensation that players will receive for being part of this game, which I've heard is $500. Maybe you can clarify that one way or another. Where do we stand with respect to the video game? Are any of these news stories putting the game at risk of a delayed launch or not being launched at all? What is the latest with respect to this thing, and will it happen next summer as I think we've expected all along?
Yeah, let me talk the collective college football internet off the ledge a little bit.
Okay, good.
Nothing that has happened over the last month should give anybody any reason to think that the game is going to be delayed. I've seen a lot of the speculative news stories. I've talked to people at EA. I've talked to people in the major collegiate licensing world. I've talked to some of the other companies that bid on some of these open, some of the group license agreements, and they've all said the exact same thing. Let me try to explain where you've seen some of the frustrations and boycott information or lawsuits about this, and I mean, kind of tie it all how this works here with the game, right? So it's important that EA has not actually finalized a proposed contract and sent it to any players yet. They're not going to do that, I believe, this calendar year at all, because we don't know who's going to be eligible to be in the game for next year. We have to wait for rosters to be settled. There is a ballpark number that's been passed around. I saw Sportico reported this. I think On3 reported it. And when I've talked to some of the other companies that were involved in these conversations, they said we can't confirm that number, but that's in the ballpark. 500, 600, 800-ish dollars is around what's being tentatively proposed, which is very different from a lot of the other group licensing deals for professional games. If you are in Madden, if you're in NBA 2K, if you're in MLB The Show, your individual cut is healthy four figures, if not more. And that number is usually tied to a royalty rate, a percentage of the sales of the game. EA might say, all right, we're going to give the NFLPA, or we're going to give, whatever group we're working with, 10%, and then we'll divide up the money, from there, right?
Right.
Which is not what's being talked about here so far for the college side. It is what's happening for the schools. The schools get a certain amount of money depending on how well they've done in the AP poll over the last decade or so. And that money comes from a projected percentage of sales, right? It's like, I think it's 10%. And if you're really good, you get like $120,000. And if you're Nebraska, you get like 10.
Okay.
Or somebody that's missed the top 25 over the last decade. So you're seeing a couple of different groups express a lot of frustration with this. And it isn't so much about the money. There's good reasons why the player pool is going to be smaller, and we can talk about that if people are interested. You have the CFBPA, which is a player advocacy group led by a guy named Jason Stahl, used to be a professor at Minnesota, who was frustrated not just with the money, but with the fact that players were not involved in negotiating any part of this deal. Players did not select the company that's representing them in these conversations, which is a firm called One Team Partners. They didn't have any conversations with EA Sports. It was just like somebody else is making a deal and presenting the deal to you. And they, as a player group, they feel that that's not fair, and that's why they're not getting a good enough deal. You have another company called Brandar, who does group licensing deals for many schools in college football right now. They represent athletes at Ohio State, Florida, Michigan, many other schools. And if you like buy a jersey that has a player's name on it, chances are Brandar facilitated that group licensing deal, and they pay the money to the players and the school. And Brandar is suing EA because they said, you can't do this deal with this other company because we were contracted to represent the players at these schools for group licensing deals. You should be going through us, and we would be negotiating for more money for the players. Neither of those, the thing about either of these lawsuits or either of these complaints is that they don't impact the development of the game. CFBPA, the College Football Players Association, has very few active players actually involved. It's a small organization. The bulk of the membership are ex-college football players. So current players, that's not like a players union. Like, they don't have a mandate from current players to do this. Overwhelmingly, we see this on social media. This has been my conversation with players. They want to be in the game, and they're not going to jeopardize not being in the game for $500, $750. The Brandar, that's a lawsuit that's over money, and they might cloak themselves in player activism and in athletic empowerment, and they might even believe some of those things, but fundamentally it's a dispute over contracts. EA communicated back in 2001, hey, if we can't get player likenesses, we're still going to make this game. We're just going to randomize all the players and lock roster control. There's no reason for me to think, and no reason that EA is communicating to anybody on the record or off the record, that they're not going to get the player licenses. They might get 9,000 instead of 11,000. We'll have a couple of QB Aggies, running around who didn't get their paperwork signed in time. But that's not going to change the deal. The only thing that would change the timeline of this game is if schools decide we're out. We said we were in, we're out. They're not going to ship this if they don't have Notre Dame, Ohio State, Washington, and 10 other schools. But that's not where we are right now. So I would encourage everybody, if you don't care about the nitty gritty of licensing stuff, which is what my people care about, like, if that's not you, just relax. You're going to get the game next summer. The licensing stuff is not why it was delayed in the first place. It's not why it's going to be delayed now.
Is there an ongoing conversation about what proper compensation would look like from some of these groups, right? If they're arguing that 500, 700, whatever the final figure isn't enough, what would be enough?
Well, it's a great question. And I for me personally, and this has been shared by folks with the CFPP as well, the correct answer is whatever you negotiate, like whatever the free market sets up. The dispute here is so much that the players weren't involved, had no voice in that conversation, like the NFLPA or the NBA Players Union has. What I can tell you is, like, it's not going to be the same as Madden. And there's a couple of reasons for that. It's not going to be the same as NBA 2K. For one, EA Sports wants to pay for the licenses for every single scholarship FBS player. There's 85 of those. We've got over 130 FBS teams. I have a liberal arts degree, so I'm not great at multiplication, but that shows as over 11,000. The NFLPA represents, I think, a little under 2,500 people. So we're paying for a ton of licenses. Of course, they're not going to be the same. There's also the fact that when you play a college football video game, Ty, I think this was probably your experience. It's been mine. It's been the way most people I've talked to. You play when you play the NCAA games, you're generally playing the dynasty mode.
Yep.
And that means every year, every 6 hours of gameplay, a quarter of the guys graduate and they turn into randomized players. So if you play the game for 4 days, you're not playing with the likenesses of anybody, even if you did pay for all of those. That's not the core part of the game. It's the same thing if you're doing Road for Glory. If you're playing like a single player, I'm going to be the QB at Notre Dame, all the guys graduate. If you play Madden, Pat Mahomes is going to be part of your Madden experience unless you play for like 2 months, because he's going to be in the NFL for another decade. And those that's the same thing for the NBA or for most other sports. So the value of an individual license is going to be lower. You add all of that to the fact we haven't had this game for a decade and projecting sales numbers is more complicated. All of
Right.
those are reasons why that number is going to be substantially lower. Whether it's 500, 900, 1,000, like for me, I don't think that that really changes the conversation that much. It's more about who is involved in the room. And that's honestly a more difficult question to answer without a union and without some level of professionalization.
One more question on the game that I promise we'll get to some other subjects. Totally separate from the whole compensation boycott piece of this. Have we learned anything new since we last chatted a couple months ago about what the game's actually going to be like? Gameplay,
Yep.
modes, what are realistic expectations for folks like you and I? Look, we're older now than we were the last time we played this game.
I know I didn't have this gray hair, right?
I,
The
I,
last time my knees didn't make snap, crackle, and pop sounds when I turned on my Xbox. It's been a minute.
it's been a minute, but I think we're still pretty excited about it because there is this sense of nostalgia. It was a big part of, I think, the college experience for many of us,
Yeah.
certainly played a role in our college football fandom. So we're eager to know, what are we paying for? What do we get with this new version?
So I don't think I've written this yet, but I can share here that I believe there's a pretty good chance we're going to get substantially more information about gameplay and development during this season. And I honestly wouldn't be surprised if this comes from EA relatively early in the season, come August, September. A lot of these studios are in Orlando. If you happen to have some big non-conference matchups, or you have some big games that are going to be around there, maybe EA invites some of those guys to the studios to begin some motion capture, some facial capture. Like that's a way to kind of begin this sort of conversation. When I've talked to people involved with the game, there's been a lot of reticence to talk about specific gameplay features because a lot of that's still under development. But what has been reiterated to me multiple times is EA believes the flagship mode of this game is Dynasty. It's not Ultimate
Good,
Team, which
good.
I know freaks everybody on the internet out. Like I'm told Ultimate Team is that there's going to be a part of that in the game. They're like, we recognize that the bread and butter of this is Dynasty mode. And one
Good.
of the things that I've been told is they wanted to really revamp how recruiting worked. And part of that is because recruiting and player acquisition and roster management look very different now than they did in 2014. NIL, transfer portal, that's part of the game. But I was also told they want to change the loop. I actually have the most recent game set up in my office. I have my TV kind of off screen here, and I've played it a decent amount over the summer. I've lied to myself and said it was for work. It wasn't
Sure.
for work. Yeah,
Same
but
here.
what people have been telling me is like we want to make this so during the week to week gameplay of the season, and you're doing your game and you're doing recruiting, that you develop a sense of excitement to be playing with the players that you're recruiting right now to kind of continue the loop. And you have a sense of continued satisfaction and achievement in recruiting from week to week. Because beforehand, you may not get a commitment until week 7 or week 8. The first couple of weeks would be pretty fluid. But like if you have a guy that you're recruiting, it's going to be a speedster, and you know that he's gonna start be your third wide receiver as a true freshman. He's going to change your playbook. EA wants you the player, to know that in week 3. And then like, I want to keep playing because I can't wait to work this guy in here. I know him. I've played with him a little bit better, which I think is different. I know also that they have reached out to not only coaches, but some reporters for advice on how to make this process more realistic. A lot of those guys signed NDAs, so we can't completely pump them for information. You probably know who some of them are.
I do.
So I tell everybody, I can't promise you the game's going to be good. I wish that I could. I've played EA games before. Some of them are amazing. Some of them are EA games. But what I can promise you is that this is not a Madden reskin, and that this team is dedicating a lot of time to make this as realistic a college football game as possible heading into 2014.
I think in July 2023, that's enough, frankly,
Yeah.
to assuage a lot of concerns that might be out
that's the hope, right? Like,
Sure.
I mean, I understand. Like every time I write about something about the game, my mentions in my email, and I check Reddit sometimes, it's just people, crapping on the company, or like, how could you possibly have high expectations for this? I mean, I'm going to play it no matter what. Like, I'm sure it's going to be fun, but I think many of the knee-jerk negative reactions are honestly a little bit unfair, given what I know is going on here. I know this company doesn't always deserve the benefit of the doubt, but if it's bad, I think it'll be bad in a new way. I don't think you're going to see the same linebackers jumping 11 feet in the air, intercepting every pass that you will in this game, which was that was the thing in the last couple of Xbox games, right? You couldn't throw over the middle. There'll be unique bugs, I think, in this version.
If they take away my square outs, I'm doomed. But that's a
It
separate.
sucks. We're going to have to learn new plays. The RPOs didn't exist the last time we had this here, right? Like we're gonna have to learn and grow as a football analyst, and that I'm not into that.
If they're asking me to make quick decisions at 11 p.m. when I'm tired from editing all day, it could be sort of a nightmare. But yeah. I'm excited nonetheless. I appreciate the update. Keep us in the loop if you hear anything new. We'll of course bring you back on if and when. I do want to shift gears though, because there's a lot going on in your world in particular. I wanted to ask you about this Mountain West San Diego State thing that is going on, which is just high comedy and only underscores the fact that in college football, the real uniqueness, the real lifeblood of this thing is the fact that nobody's actually running it. Where things stand, and hopefully you can provide a little bit of clarity here. I know you've done some reporting on this. San Diego State is reportedly interested in joining the Pac-12 if and when an invitation comes, presumably after the Pac-12 seals the deal on some media rights agreement, which has taken far too long and they've dragged their feet. And maybe it's because there's not a great deal to be had. Who knows? Hopefully we'll find that out sooner than later. San Diego State, though, has been put into a bit of a box because if they wanted to declare any intentions to leave for 2024 and join the Pac-12, they needed to notify the Mountain West before July 1, or I guess
June 30th.
June 30th was sort of their final cutoff. Otherwise, they had to pay a full exit fee of $34 million, which of course they did not want to do. So they kind of did like a halfway thing, I guess shrouded in a bit of legalese, in that they sent a letter announcing their intention to resign, but they did not mean that they were actually resigning, right? It kind of gave them a little bit of like wiggle room, maybe open to interpretation. Are they leaving? Are they not leaving? The Mountain West says, screw you. We're going to take this as your official resignation. San Diego State has said, that's not what we meant. We were just like, I guess, cordially notifying them that maybe they would at some point.
Yeah.
What is the Mountain West really going to kick San Diego State out? What?
I don't think they're going to do that. Although one of the ways that I've had a couple of my readers kind of describe the situation, which feels apt, is if you're at dinner with your wife and you mention, "Hey, I'm thinking about filing for divorce at a future date," you can't be surprised if she comes back with papers like the next day, even though you're like, "Hey, I'm thinking about this. We're gonna see what Judy from accounting thinks about me, and then we're gonna reevaluate." Like, no, then she's gonna leave you, and that's a little bit of the situation here, where in both in public and in private, like I can report, San Diego State has been very upfront about wanting to be in the Pac-12. Nobody in the Mountain West is surprised by any contents of this letter. Like, these are things that have been communicated in privately. And I think the administration of San Diego State was thinking, hey, if we over communicate and let them know about what's going on here, maybe we can get a little bit of flexibility around this deadline, because if we probably can't make June 30th, but we could probably make September 30th. And maybe we can find a way to save some of this extra $17 million deal. And to be fair, that's not an irrational thought process.
No,
because the way that this works most of the time is the bylaws will say there's one exit fee, and then what people actually pay and the schedule they pay it is something different. It's happened with Texas and Oklahoma. It happened with teams leaving the Ohio Valley Conference. It happened with teams leaving the American. Maybe you agree to pay more over a longer period of time. Maybe you pay less, but you pay it up front. Like, San Diego State is ultimately good for the whole $34 million, especially because they're going to be getting a raise if they go to the Pac-12, but they don't have that liquid. They need all of the liquid money they can get to build stuff and hire people to get ready to play Oregon and Washington and Stanford on a regular basis. What I think is going to happen is eventually San Diego State's going to go to the Pac-12, and there's going to be some lawyerly conversation here, and San Diego State ends up paying like $29 million instead of $34 million or something. You have to act tough in correspondence because you don't want to remove your negotiating leverage here, but it's in the Mountain West's best interest to not just kick them out of spite, because the Mountain West needs San Diego State for the television. This conference right now only has, I think, 2 or 3 schools in top 40 television markets, and one of them is San Jose State, which doesn't have a whole lot of fans, isn't exactly delivering eyeballs in a big market. There is a big concern that if San Diego State leaves, Fox and CBS are going to come back to the Mountain West and saying, we got to renegotiate the deal. We're not going to pay you $4 million a year for Wyoming, Utah State anymore, now that we've lost this huge population center. So they're not going to kick them out, even if they're really mad at them. If the worst case scenario, the Pac-12 falls apart, there's no invitation coming, San Diego State pays some kind of we're sorry $4 million embarrassment fee, and they stick around. Which if you remember, happened before.
Yeah.
San Diego State was a member of the Big East for like 20 minutes, and then had to go pay a fee if you want to go play through like the old Wikipedia membership timeline there, back when Boise State was in the Big East for like an hour, and this whole thing. That's kind of where we are. I understand that it's funny from the outside, and it looks like nobody really knows what they're doing. I think this is just an example of lawyering that normally happens outside of the public eye, and somebody got mad about, tipped off a reporter. We all filed FOIAs, and then we got to see it.
I know it's not necessarily with respect to San Diego State and the Mountain West, but have you heard anything on the Pac-12 media rights?
What I've been telling people, because I hear stuff a lot, and I've completely given up trying to prognosticate it, because I have heard both with the certainty that it's coming in 2 weeks, and I've heard with the certainty that the league is 2 weeks from dissolving and being scattered across the wind. And I've written this here, right? I'm like, look, man, you look in the New Testament, and it says that nobody knows but not even the angels of heaven know when Jesus is coming back, right? Like that's the same thing with this. That there's going to, nobody knows. And I understand that there are university presidents in the Pac-12 that are leaking and trying to tell people it's coming, it's coming. I think it's probably going to come eventually, and it's probably going to be some embarrassing distribution numbers, but the money is going to be just good enough so people don't jump to the Big 12. But my willingness to give sources the benefit of the doubt about this has expired. Part of what's made this such a weird story isn't that it's taken this long. Actually, the Big Ten took about this long too. It's just that there wasn't a leak every 20 minutes. And part of that is because you've got people affiliated with the Big 12 that are trying to sow fear and doubt and confusion. You've got a whole cottage industry of YouTubers and C-list connected media analysts and very retired people that are flooding the zone with information. And you've got people from the broadcasting companies trying to negotiate in public by leaking things here, which typically isn't the case. And I think that presents a public narrative of something that's much more confusing than it typically is. And it makes it really hard to sift through what information we can trust and what we can't. I will say there are a hell of a lot more people talking about the Pac-12 deal than people who are talking to those who actually know about what's happening with the deal, because these are small groups that really, really know what's going on.
My theory is exactly yours. There's been an overabundance of Big 12 friendly media. And that's not to say that it's coming directly from the Big 12. I'm sure it's coming through conduits.
I don't think it is. Yeah.
But my sense is that there's a lot of that out in the ether, and that has driven this narrative for better or worse. I mean, look, Brett Yormark's a New York guy. He has been very aggressive since taking over the Big 12. It would not surprise me if this was one of the tactics that he was attempting to try and get his conference that spans every time zone here in the United States. But it just feels like it's been far too much in the balance of the Big 12, much of the discussion anyway, and that's why I don't fully believe it.
I think there's some real truth to that, and I'll also say this, and this is not a criticism or anything pejorative, but if I was a fan of a Big 12 institution, and my conference had been left for dead a couple of different times over the last decade, and I had spent years and years of feeling that I was looked down upon by the ivory tower AAU Pac-12 institutions, and my school has truck stops and we're not academically prestigious enough, or I'm in Manhattan, Kansas, and you feel for a minute that you can turn the tables.
Yeah,
of course you're going to do that.
No, I don't.
So I don't blame them at all. It's fun to stick it in the eye of Stanford. I like to do the same thing, right? Like, so, and so I think there's some level of wish casting among not just reporters, but some of the other people that are sharing this information, in part because, it was the other way around for so long. And when you're in a position to be the aggressor, it's hard not to want to take it.
I mean, some of us are old enough to remember Texas and Oklahoma and some others joining the Pac-12
Yeah,
and the Big 12 being on the receiving end of all the jokes. So now that this thing has come full circle, I don't blame them at all. They feel they've got leverage. And
sure.
so when you've got your advantage, you press it, whether or not they end up picking off any teams from the Pac-12, that's a separate discussion. And well, I guess we'll figure out in time whenever we find out the deal behind this media rights thing. But
Yeah.
it's been a very interesting story to follow on a number of different fronts, and I'm sure you've got all sorts of people talking to you about it. Um, Let me shift gears again and talk about another thing that you are privy to that I am not, and that is kind of this overarching discussion about athleticism, amateur athleticism, let's say, in college sports. You came on this show, I want to say about a year ago, and talked about the new direction of the NCAA. They were hiring, in essence, a politician, Charlie Baker, a former governor, to take the reins of this thing. You speculated that's because the NCAA recognized that its next fight was going to be with the legislative bodies and not necessarily schools, um, essentially trying to preserve its own existence, get some sort of federal NIL bill passed so that it's not all on them. Where is the NCAA at right now? Have any of those efforts been fruitful? What are we talking about a year from now with respect to the NCAA?
Yeah, that's been exactly the strategy. And the strategy has gone much better than it has with Emmert, but not so well that there's actually it is likely there's going to be a federal bill. The one of the things that Baker, I think, has done well is lean on other university presidents and other people to kind of lobby individual lawmakers. And there has been an audience of congressional Republicans that are broadly sympathetic to the NCAA's claims. What they don't have right now, though, is enough votes.
Right.
You have the Republicans are leading, or control the U.S. House, but only just barely. And within that conference, there's not really broad agreement to do much of anything. And a lot of bills need to end up having some kind of Democratic support. The Senate is 50-50, and it's not a neatly partisan issue because you have some people that don't think that any of this should be under the purview of Congress. And you have some of both political parties that are more sympathetic to the NCAA, and you have some much stronger pro-labor lawmakers that don't want to give the NCAA anything that it's asking for here. The other thing that's changed since we've last spoken, though, is that state houses have become much more aggressive. And now we have new state NIL rules in Texas and Arkansas and Missouri and now New York and potentially a couple of other places that I think in practice will make it almost impossible for the NCAA to actually enforce anti-inducement NIL rules. Coming to a head most recently with Texas and whether A&M can essentially run a collective through its official athletic department fundraising.
Right.
Last year the NCAA would go up to Congress and say, "Hey, we need a federal bill, or else we can't enforce any rules." And that was kind of dubious. But now that's pretty clear. Like they literally, somebody could give a recruit $500,000 in a briefcase, say sign one autograph. And here's the deal. And of course, that runs afoul of every NCAA policy, but there's no one who could stop that now. It would be against Texas state law. There'd be a lawsuit. The NCAA would probably lose. So they're in a tough spot. And they're in a tough spot, not just for trying to figure out how to regulate NIL. They're starting to talk about a plan B, but they also recognize that something much bigger is still on the horizon, and that's employment.
Yeah.
And part of the reason I'm spending less time getting really in the weeds about state NIL rules and arguing about that is because my belief is most of this isn't going to matter in 2 years. The NCAA, Johnson v. NCAA, the federal court case in your neck of the woods in eastern Pennsylvania, that's over. That's the question is whether FCS football players should be classified as employees. You're going to get some kind of decision on that this year. There's going to be an appeal that's going to get wrapped up next year at some point. We have another gigantic antitrust case for back NIL wages, House v. NCAA. We'll have that starting in 2025. And we have the National Labor Relations Board. And the NCAA hasn't gotten Congress to say athletes aren't employees. And because they haven't, like, people should know, sometime late this year, early next year, a judge is probably going to say some athletes are employees. And if athletes are employees, we don't really need an ecosystem of bagmen to money launder to pay them, because then schools can pay them, which is what they would rather be doing, and cut out some of the pressurized lumber middlemen, third party groups that are doing this. And that's, I think, the much bigger question everyone has to grapple with here. What happens after that?
My question on that, Matt, and maybe it's just me that needs a little bit of clarity on it, but
Yeah.
I feel like for a long time, the conversation has been, hey, the schools are fine with this ecosystem and the way it's set up, so long as they don't have to share their money. It seemingly has been that way for a good long time. But what you're saying is that actually they'd much rather cut out some of their money and not have to deal with the outside pressures.
There's a lot of truth to that at the Power 5 level. There's enough money to go around, right? You can pay the last place coach in the SEC West $2 million instead of $6.5 million, and you could spread that out around your payroll. You can have a couple fewer analysts. You don't have to gold plate the locker room, which is what the NFL does, or the NBA does.
Right.
And the advantage to doing it this way is you have some semblance of control. Like Nick Saban has said this, James Franklin has said this. I think we've seen some other elite coaches or coaches at high-profile programs say, like, we should move to more of an NFL model. And it's, most coaches, there's a couple of true believers out there, but not as many, especially guys that have spent time in the NFL and realize what I really want as a coach is predictability and control, rather than maximizing my own money or the money for my assistants. And if we have a collective bargaining agreement, we know when players can leave and when they can't. We know about how much money they'll get and what they can expect in the open market. We know who we're negotiating with and how we're negotiating. And there's a system, and we can prepare around it. Without those things, you have perpetual free agency. You have rules that differ from school to school and state to state. And you have a world of a lot of instability. And you get, we might argue, you get paid $7 million, man. Like, you can be a grown-up and you can figure some of this stuff out. But that's, if you moved away from that world, it would make things much easier for many athletic departments. Now, a professionalized world means something very different for Illinois State, right, or San Jose State, or Tarleton State, or many private schools. But would it make life easier for Penn State? Yeah. In almost every way, I think it would.
And you think this is going to happen?
I do. The question to me is not, will some college athletes become employees in the next 3 years? I think, looking at what judges are saying in oral arguments, looking at what the Supreme Court has said, looking at where the legal jurisprudence has gone over the past couple of years, I do think that's inevitable. There's enough legal challenges that a judge somewhere or a board somewhere is going to say this. What I don't know is which athletes will be employees.
Right.
It is not yet clear to me if that means every Division I athlete, Power 5 athletes, just football players, football and basketball players, what this means for track athletes. And I think anybody that's trying to tell you they know exactly what that means is not being truthful. I don't think the law is explicit about that yet. And that's something that Congress could have a role in. It's something university presidents could have a role in. It's something that athlete organizers could have a role in. And I would also say, I'm not 100% convinced that making all athletes employees is a net positive system for everybody. But whether it's good or bad is moot compared to what the law says. Like, fundamentally, universities have to follow the law, and we'll see what these lawsuits end up deciding here. We're going to look at a very different college sports world in a couple of years.
How different does that look? Final question, then I'll move on to something else, because you could get really bogged down talking about the future state of college football if this does come to fruition. But on the surface, right, if student athletes are employees, the college can pay them directly. Clearly that has an impact with respect to things like recruiting. You can offer the money up front. You're not having to go through an intermediary, things like that. Perhaps the way we cover recruiting changes. Perhaps the way that rosters are constructed also changes because, again, with some element of control, perhaps there are athletic departments, perhaps there are coaches that choose to wield that power and influence and money a little bit differently than they would otherwise. But does it fundamentally change the product that you and I see on a Saturday?
That's a good question. And I think if you're a fan of a bigger college football program, I don't know if it changes things that much. Like we already have people who go to our schools and our students and also employees, right? If you go to a big R1 research school, state flagship like a Penn State or Ohio State, you've got graduate assistants that are employees. Graduates. There's even a graduate student union at many big schools right now that are able to do both. And I imagine if we move towards a professionalized system, there's going to be some kind of union or some kind of other force on the other side of the negotiating table to create structure and rules. So what that means is, are you going to have to fret about somebody transferring every 2 weeks when there's a window like there is for the NFL or there is for the NBA? Like that many fans might look at that as a positive. You might be able to sign people to multi-year agreements, right? Like, okay, you can leave, but then you have to forfeit X, Y, and Z money, or we can't guarantee there's going to be another spot for you. Like that, all those things maybe a net positive. There's also a question though of, can Arkansas State afford to function in that environment, or can Central Michigan or Youngstown State? And if you're a fan of any of those schools, I think you have to think about what would another model look like. Are you okay competing in a different kind of world? But whether they're employees or contractors, or they just get revenue sharing or something else, in 2027, like Notre Dame and Oregon are going to play a football game or something. And those people are probably still going to be students. And I think the stadium is still going to be full. It's just a much bigger question of what happens to everybody else.
Let's shift gears once more, Matt. What is the state on the ground in Chicago, given the news of the week? We discussed it as best we could on our last episode. We recorded with Roger Sherman and picked his brain on all things Northwestern. We expected that things would go the way that they did with Fitzgerald. We didn't expect it would happen so quickly. So we had to scramble our jets and re-record large swaths of the episode just so that it wasn't immediately outdated. It doesn't seem like it's a shocking turn given what we found out via the student newspaper, given the response from the university president, but now I guess a bit removed from the decision to unceremoniously fire Pat Fitzgerald. We have seen some other news stories pop up about him retaining a law firm, perhaps some money that is still out there for the taking on his behalf. What is your take on what we've seen happen since?
I think where we are right now is that this story is not over by a long shot. And part of what I do in my beat with Extra Points is I have to focus a lot on how athletic departments are actually run and the process that schools use to reach certain decisions and how this sausage is made. And I think it would surprise a lot of your listeners and a lot of other fans when they learned that the hiring process for coaches, and even sometimes the real management of coaches, is really not done by athletic directors. Athletic directors have to own those decisions, but in many cases, it's boosters or regents or the university president or other third parties that wield a ton of influence in who gets hired, who gets fired, who gets extended, and who even gets disciplined. And whenever you have a school where the coach of any sport becomes so powerful that the athletic director or the school itself can't meaningfully check them in any way, I think you run into or risks of some big problems. There's a couple of schools and coaches I think we could probably brainstorm where that's the case right now, where one coach is the de facto athletic director. And in many ways, I think that was the case with Fitzgerald at Northwestern. You have a new AD, and you have a new AD in part because the guy they hired to be the AD last time had to quit after 10 days because of his role in abuse lawsuits and the community completely rejecting him. You have a new university president, been there less than a year from Oregon. And then you have a guy that's been there who was the single most important guy at Northwestern since they were the Fighting Methodists. Like the literal father of this sport, or this program at the school. And you get rid of that guy. I think you have to ask a bunch of really important questions about who actually made that decision and why they made that decision after essentially having the same information on Friday and deciding to go in a different direction. What it looks like to me is that Northwestern wanted to keep this guy, tried to news dump an investigation that was really vague and didn't point direct figures at anybody, and hoped it would go away because there's no beat writers at Northwestern from the Chicago newspapers or anything. And then the student newspaper blew that all up by getting the very specific stuff out there, and enough people internally complained that then they had to reverse course.
Right.
And that may be the right decision. Maybe it was. I think it probably was the right decision. But if you reach that decision with a bad process, it's not that you just, wasted $35 million that you're going to have to pay Pat Fitzgerald when he sues you. But you have some systems that need to be reevaluated when you hire a new guy. And this is happening right after you had an AD where you had a similar story. You've got a scandal with the baseball coach and a rotten culture happening right now. And the president and AD aren't really around. So I think there's a bigger question at play here about who's really running things in Northwestern and who's making decisions and who's responsible for building a better culture. And that's something that can take down a president. That's something that can take down an AD. That's something that can alienate some core donors. And Northwestern is not a school that has a really deep donor base. It has a handful of guys that have a lot of influence. And it's a terrible time for this to be happening because Northwestern is also trying to completely rebuild Ryan Field. A gigantic football infrastructure project is happening, and it's one that Evanston residents don't want. So you're already going to be dealing with not just a fundraising issue, but a big political battle. And now if you've got a bunch of people who don't like Northwestern athletics anyway, and as Roger could probably tell you and Dan could tell you, there's a weird dynamic between the town and the gown up at Northwestern, this is going to make it worse. And I look at this as not just a tragedy for the players involved and a football story as this program tries to figure out who the hell they're going to hire or what they want to be, given that they haven't had a new identity since like 1994. But also, I think you're going to see other administrators leave, and something that can have real ramifications throughout a very important research university.
It seems like the kind of thing that we're not done hearing about firings. No. If it was a bad process that led us to this horrible situation, on a couple different levels, if they want to move forward with any kind of football renovations, they're going to have to be more heads that roll.
This reminds me a little bit of where Kansas football was a couple of years ago with Les Miles. And it's one thing to let go of the coach who was popular internally because of some scandals, but then you have to realize, like, wow, we had a terrible process that led us to get here. And so Jeff Long's got to go. And then we have to really evaluate, the other regents and the other power brokers and everybody else that led us to get to this point. And you had a very big change with Kansas athletics. I've seen some people compare this to Penn State. I don't know if that's a perfect analogy. I could see some superficial similarities, and that's still a situation that in many ways hasn't been resolved internally with various power brokers at that school still fighting over that. And there's the possibility that could happen at Northwestern too. And if you want to just talk about on the field, guys, like if you're our age, or if you're older, you know what Northwestern was like before Fitzgerald. Like the floor is not 3-9. The floor is worst team in college football. Right. And if you're not able to get your limited fan base and community on the same page and going the same direction in a league now where your schedule's about to get much harder, this thing could get ugly in a hurry. Yeah. This is a program where the ceiling, we know what the ceiling is. But boy, howdy, the floor is real low.
It'll be interesting.
It won't be boring.
To say the least. Let's shift gears one final time and talk about more positive news. We talked at the start of this conversation about EA Sports and its college football video game that is forthcoming, presumably in summer of 2024. You have also been hard at work at a game of your own. It is not a college football game, at least not purely a college football game, but athletics, excuse me, but Athletic Director Simulator 3000 is exactly the type of nerd content that I think the Verballerhood would be interested in hearing more about. So, speak to me about what it's been like to develop a game on your own, why you've developed this game at all, and more importantly, what is it?
Yeah, so I'll give you the full story, which I think this crew might be interested in. Like 5 or 6 months ago, I did an Extra Points newsletter post with a really simple Python game that I called, Athletic Director Simulator 3000. It was all text. I made it as a joke. In part because I was trying to learn a little bit of Python on the side because I do a bunch of data analysis and big spreadsheets for my work. And I thought, hey, maybe learning to code a little bit might help if I'm breaking down budgets. And this joke game is a way to see if I figured out how to do loops correctly, right? And it was just 5 questions. If you spend a bunch of money on Extra Points, you did well. If you hired Houston Nutt, you didn't do as well. And it was a little thing, right? My nerd people loved it. But what was shocking to me, even though the whole game took 5 minutes to play, was that a lot of athletic directors and a lot of our readers really enjoyed it. Like the feedback that we got from industry was unexpectedly strong, which led to my parent company, D1 Ticker, asking me, what would it take to make this a real game? Because a big chunk of our readership and part of how my company makes money now is selling to college students. We have kids that are studying sports management and they'll use our stuff as a textbook, and which is really funny to me, right? And I'm like, well, if we build this kind of game, and then maybe we can get college students playing it, and they can appreciate what it's like to be an AD, or what this decision making really looks like. So I'm not a developer, but we reached out to a couple of contractors to help us translate this into a real game in Java. You were using a kind of Apple IIe Oregon Trail aesthetic, so it's like black and green graphics. It's 8-bit audio of college fight songs. It looks like you're playing, right? And it's a real game at this point. Like what it does is you are asked. You start as the head of a low major school, something like an NEC kind of school. Or somebody in the Southland or something, right? Low, small budget FCS, and you have to manage your budget. You have to manage your director's cup ranking and your political support. And you get a bunch of questions that are pretty realistic, and we vetted these with people who work at these schools for situations that a school might face. How to hire a coach. How to sell your multimedia rights. What happens when a parent complains about a coach being a bully? Somebody steals the mascot. Should you set up your own licensed beer? Lots of these things here, and it's set up so there's not a perfect answer, because in real life you can make the right process and have a bad result. You could hire Scott Frost, even though that looked like the right decision at the time, or you can hire Dabo, which looked like a dumb idea at the time and it turned out great. And then so the game is built in, so you have it's not completely randomized, it's weighted, but sometimes the right decision works and sometimes it doesn't. And if you make good decisions, you get promoted and you get to be a Power 5 AD. And if you don't, you get fired. The game should be it's been in beta for a month. It should be released next week, so around the 19th or 20th of July. It runs on PC, Mac, Android, and iOS because it runs within a web browser. We're probably going to do a free trial for everybody the middle of next week. Stay tuned for that. But it's mostly going to be for subscribers. So if you like all of this stuff, you can get all of the newsletters, you can get access to the game, and we update it every week with more questions and tweak the balance, all this stuff for like $8. And we're going to see where it goes. If I get to become a better developer, or if this financially works out, we have a game plan to literally bring this to Nintendo Switch. And we're in negotiations with licensing some school IP, just like EA Sports is. So I would love to be able to say okay, now you're the AD at Penn State. Here's Penn State's logo. Here's Penn State's actual budget. Here's what Penn State makes selling tickets. Make the decisions. And we're just trying to figure out a way to do that right now without having to write a $500,000 check.
Where does this rank in terms of exciting things that you've done over the last 5 years?
This is legitimately one of my favorite things I've done since I left SB Nation. And part of that is because it's just totally new. It's right to get the chance to kind of work your brain in a different way. and it's a different medium to tell a story, and seeing people light up when they play it. I mean, this is not Football Manager yet, right? This is not the most
Right.
sophisticated spreadsheet game, but it's very clear it's not a throwaway joke. And like the music sounds pretty good, and the animations are pretty good, and it's well balanced. And I hope it will help in the classroom, and I hope people enjoy it. I hope people enjoy it as much as I have making it, because I really want to be the kind of reporter and the kind of writer that can talk about Northwestern scandals and talk about budget reports and talk about open records and also do weird stuff. And I think this is an example of the things that I find to be really personally fulfilling.
I'm really excited for you. I know it, whether it started as a joke or not. I'm really excited for you. This is a cool thing.
Yeah,
I give you credit for seeing it through.
a lot of our ideas have started as jokes. And then you never know what kind of grows from there, you know?
This podcast started as a joke. Yeah. So I'm with you.
Yeah. The newsletter kind of did, or the extra point started because I was mad at my boss at SB Nation. Like, and I didn't think that was going to become my job, and now here it is. Right, I learned most of the stuff about EA Sports College Football not on purpose. I got it because I was filing requests to figure out what because I heard Bowling Green was going to license a new beer, and I was trying to learn about that sponsorship process. I found out about this. Like, who knows what happens by accident? Like, that's how the option was born, right?
Yep.
That's how a lot of crazy football stuff happened. It was by accident.
Matt Brown, the Extra Points with Matt Brown newsletter. How can folks find you? How can folks subscribe? How can folks get their hand on this game?
You can. So the newsletter is at extrapointsmb.com. You can subscribe to the newsletter for free and get 2 emails a week. You can subscribe for $8 a month. You get 4. You get an archive of like 700 different newsletters, and you get access to the game. You go on the website. There's a big tab at the top. It says Extra Athletic Director Simulator 3000. You can play the game right there in that tab. You can find me on Twitter if it's working at Matt Brown EP. I think I'm Matt Brown on Blue Sky. I'm on Instagram.
Important disclaimer.
Yeah, I mean, you never know these days, right? You know, shoot a smoke signal or something, and one of the Matts Brown will find it and relay it to me. I cover the off the field forces that shape college athletics.
Very cool. His name is Matt Brown. Make sure you follow him. Make sure you subscribe to his newsletter. He does an incredible job, as I'm sure you can figure out on your own after listening to this discussion. Always makes us a little bit smarter. We will be back next week. Dan will be with us on our next episode. For that guy over there, Matt Brown, still in the heart of the Midwest. For myself, Ty Hildenbrandt, thanks for downloading, for listening, for supporting the Solid Verbal. Make sure you check us out at verballers.com. That is our Patreon. Make sure you follow along on YouTube and across all social media. Last but certainly not least, hit subscribe, hit follow so that you don't miss any more episodes. We'll talk to you all next week. Stay solid.